Parshat Ekev. Let me get the source sheet up. Can
you make it bigger?
Yeah. Is that good or bigger?
A little bigger. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to tonight look at material that we've explored before. And I think it's stuff that will at least conceptually be familiar, but I think is important to revisit every once in a while. And that is that Parshat Ekev contains, as do most of the Parshiot in Sefer Devarim, contains some very rich material, including the second paragraph of the Shema. And I think last year or 2 years ago, we actually explored that in great depth. Our organizing principle was from Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was a leading philosopher in Israel and is the brother of Nechama Leibowitz. And he offered the theory that the first paragraph of the Shema speaks of V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, you should love Hashem. The second paragraph, the one that's in our parsha, talks about V'haya im shamoa, that if you will listen, then good things will happen to you. And if you won't listen, then bad things will happen to you. And the final paragraph, the Gemara tells us, talks about ol mitzvot, talks about mitzvot, about tefillin, about mezuzah, about learning Torah. And so he says that, again, this is just a review from previous years, but he offers the theory that the first two paragraphs represent different paths to getting to God. There are those who follow the path of ahava, of love of God. That's the first paragraph of the Shema. There are those who follow the path of yira, of worshiping God out of a sense of fear or dread. That's represented by the second paragraph, which talks about reward and punishment. He said it doesn't matter which path you're on or what your motivating factor is. What really matters is the third paragraph, the V'haya im the paragraph that talks about mitzvot. And whether your motivation is through love or through fear, so long as you get to a point of observing the mitzvot, that's what really matters. So that was one interesting discussion piece around the second paragraph of the Shema, but we're going to tonight focus a little bit more narrowly on one verse. And again, it's the first verse of the second chapter, of the second paragraph of Shema. It appears in the 11th chapter of Devarim. It's one that's, I know, is familiar to all of us. V'haya im shamoa tishma'u al mitzvotai, asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom li'ahavat Hashem Elokechem, u'le'avdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem. If you will listen to my commandments, which I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to worship him with all your heart and with all your soul. And so there's also, right, there's a very strong parallel to the first paragraph of the Shema as well. But if you look in source number 3, the Sifrei, which is the Midrash Halacha on Sefer Devarim, the Sifrei struggles to understand what this verse means. So it begins, Ule Avdo, to worship God. What does it mean to worship God? If I were to ask you, what does it mean to worship God?
Or to recognize that God is.
What was that?
To follow him, to follow everything he says.
Okay, so to follow what God says, to observe God's commandments.
Serve.
To serve God, is that different than what Cheryl said? Just trying to flesh out.
Like avodah, and with the implication directly of worship, veneration, but also obedience and so on. So Cheryl's definition is broad and includes a number of things. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
About to recognize that all things come from God.
Recognize that all things come from God. Okay. All right, so let's see what the Sifrei says. The Sifrei says, Ula Avdo, to serve him, Ze Talmud, refers to Talmud, right, to learning, to studying. Ata Omer Ze Talmud, o Eno Ela Avoda. Well, is it Talmud? Is it study, or is it service? I think it's reading it as Robert might have read, was implying. Harehu Omer, Vaikach Hashem Elokim et ha'adam vayanichehu began Eden le'ovda u'leshomra. So it says in the very beginning of the Torah in Parshat Breshit that God took Adam, took man, and placed him in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, le'ovda u'leshomra, to work it and to protect it. V'chima avoda l'she'avar mashmir l'she'avar. What work was needed at that time? God provided for Adam and Chava. What guarding or protection was needed? Halamadata la'avda ze Talmud l'shomra elu mitzvot. So it must be that avoda refers to study, and lishmor refers to performing the mitzvot. Ukashim she'avodat mizbeach kriya avoda, kach Talmud kriya avoda. And just like worship on the altar is called avoda, is called service, so too is study of Torah called avoda. So the first opinion says that avoda, le'avdo, refers to study, refers to Talmud. The next paragraph, davar acher, ule'avdo zo tefillah. To worship God means specifically to pray. Ata omer zo tefillah o eno ela avoda. Well, is it prayer or is it avoda? And here I think it means avoda, like worship of the in the temple. I'm going to display the English. Sorry, I didn't do that earlier. So it quotes our verse, with all your heart, with all your soul. Avoda balev, right? Is there such a thing as worship of service in the heart? So what does the Torah mean when it tells us la'avdo, to worship him, to serve him? Zo tefillah. It must be tefillah. It must be prayer. V'chein David omer, tekon tefillati ketoret lifanecha, masat kapai minchat erev. David says that my prayer should be like ketoret, like the incense. And my the elevation of my hand should be like the gift offering in the evening. So prayer is compared to the sacrificial worship. Daniel, and it also quotes a verse from Daniel. Daniel learned that the writing had been inscribed. He went home. He had windows open in his upper story facing Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he fell to his knees and gave thanks before his God, exactly as he used to do before this. And later it says in Daniel, when the king drew near to the pit to Daniel, he cried out in a sad voice. The king answered and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of living God, was your God whom you serve continually able to save you from the lions? So since Daniel prayed, it's telling us that the avoda, that the service, the work of Daniel is prayer. So then the Medrash continues. It says, was there a temple service? Was there a Beis Hamikdash in Bavel? What does it mean that Daniel was oved, that he served, that he worshipped God? So it must be that la'avdo refers to prayer and not to the temple or sacrificial worship. And just like the service on the altar is called avoda, so too is prayer called avoda. Rabbi Eliezer offers a third opinion. He says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, ula'avdo, to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. Harezo azhara lakohanim shlo yehe libam cholek b'shat avoda. This is a warning to the Kohanim that their heart should not be distracted at the time of service. So he understands avoda to literally be temple or sacrificial service, and the way that you do that with your heart is to be fully present and focused and in the moment. And finally, a fourth opinion, davar acher matam ulomar b'chol levavchem v'chol nafshechem, halo kvar ne'emar b'chol levavecha v'chol nafshecha. It already says in the first paragraph of Shema, with all your heart and with all your soul. Right? Lahalan liyachid kan litzibor. Lahalan litalmud kan limaaseh. So it offers two distinctions. It says, on the one hand, in the first paragraph of Shema, it's in Lashon Yachid. It's in the singular. And so it's referring to an individual. And here in our paragraph, it's in the plural. So it's referring to the community, communal obligation. Also, Lahalan letalmud kan lemaaser. The first paragraph, it says, refers to study. The second refers to deed, to action. Hoyo v'shamata ase asitem masha aleichem afani aseh masha alai v'natati mataratzachem. So if you do what you have to do, God promises that He'll do what He has to do and provide for us rain. So we have a range of opinions about what this ula avdo, what it means to serve God, might be. Right? It might be, right, the most literal sense seems to be sacrificial worship. We have a position that says it refers to study. We have a position that says it refers to prayer. And we have a position that says it refers to ma'aseh, to deed, to action. Any questions or comments so far?
Maybe it's supposed to be all of them.
Okay, so certainly they all ring true, right? Certainly we know we have to do all of them. We're going to get, though, a little bit more technical, meaning, yeah, all those are true. We have to study Torah, we have to do mitzvot, we have to have a proper kavana. That's for sure true. But right, we're focused on what exactly this verse is teaching us. So the Gemara in Tanit weighs in on our debate, and the Gemara tells us, right, it's a little bit of an interesting roundabout way that the Gemara gets here, but it's talking about when do we make the various insertions into the Amida, which are seasonal based, right? Mashiv Haruach Meira Geshem, the prayer for the mention of rain in the second bracha of the Amida, and also the V'tein bracha or V'tein talu matar livracha, the request for rain in the middle section of the Amida. So the Gemara is talking about when do we start to say these insertions, and in the course of its discussion, it asks umenalan bitfila. So, right, how do we know that we have to mention rain and God's power to bring rain specifically in tefillah? When the Gemara says tefillah, it means the Amidah, what we call the Shmona Esrei, or the Amidah. So how do we know that this has to be mentioned in our prayer, in our Amidah? Ditanya, as it says, Le'ahavat Hashem Elokechem u'la'avdo b'chol levavchem, quotes our verse, to love God and to serve Him with all of your heart. Ezo hi avoda shehi balev. What is service or worship in the heart? Heve omer zo tefillah. We must say that this is prayer. And then later on in that same paragraph, it mentions that God will bring rain. So that's how the Gemara knows that we have to mention rain in the Amidah. But it seems to weigh in on the position we saw in the Sifrei that the Avoda refers to specifically to prayer, specifically to the Amidah. And if we go to the next source, number 5, we have the Rambam. The Rambam tells us, and someone please let me know when I need to scroll down for the continuation of the English. Mitzvah taseh litpalel b'chol yom. There is a positive commandment to pray every day. Shene'emar, va'avadatem et Hashem Elokechem. As it says, you should worship Hashem, your God. Mipi hashmua lamdu, she'avoda zohi tefillah. And there's a tradition that teaches that this service refers to prayer. Shene'emar, as it says, and now he quotes our verse, Ula avdo b'chol levavchem, to worship Him with all of your heart. Amru chachamim, zohi avoda shebalev, zo tefillah. The sages say, what is worship that takes place in the heart? It must be prayer. So the Rambam uses our verse to teach us that there is a biblical requirement, a biblical mitzvah, to pray every day. Ve'ein minyan hatfilot min haTorah, ve'ein mishne hatfilah hazot min haTorah, ve'ein letfila zman kavua min haTorah. The number of times that a person prays is not regulated in the Torah. We daven 3 times a day, 4 times if it's a holiday, we add Musaf, 5 times we add Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur. But those times of prayer are not biblically mandated. Those come from the rabbis. Neither is the content, the words that we say when we pray. There's nothing there's nothing required to say. Ve'en l'tfila zman kavua, nor is the right, that neither quantity nor the time of the day is not legislated by the Torah. So now he says something quite fascinating. Ulefichach, therefore, nashim va'avadim chayavin b'tfilah. Women and servants are obligated in prayer. Lefi shehi mitzvah taseh shelo hazman grama, because it is a positive commandment, not bound by time. Biblically speaking, what is the requirement of tefillah?
Morning and afternoon.
So he says, Ela chiyuv mitzvah zu kachi. This is what the biblical requirement is. Sheyehei adam mitchanein u'mitpalel b'chol yom u'magid shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'achar kach shoel tzrachav shehu tzarich lahem b'vakasha v'techina v'achar kach noten shevach v'hodaya laHashem ala tova shishpia lo kol echad lefi kocho. The biblical requirement is that every day a person should supplicate and pray before God by saying God's praise, afterwards asking for whatever it is that a person needs, and afterwards giving shevach v'hodaya, praise and thanksgiving to God for all the good that he has done for us.
And can you move it down?
Yes, sorry, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the Rambam tells us that the biblical requirement for prayer is very amorphous. We have to follow this very basic outline. We have to be sure to hit upon these 3 points, but that's it. We can do it at any time of the day that we want. Right? Presumably, we can do it in any language we want. And it can be as long or as short as we want.
Are women exempt from tefillah b'tzibur?
Okay, so that's a good question. So the Rambam seems to be saying that this is a mitzvah on the individual, right? Tefillah b'tzibur, prayer with a community, as we're familiar with it, that seems to be what the rabbi sort of added on to this. So women are not, presumably, wouldn't be obligated in tefillah b'tzibur, unless there's another source in the Rambam that says that this has to take place with a community. But that the fundamental obligation is incumbent on each individual. And again, just to make it crystal clear, there's a general rule in halacha that says that women and servants are exempt from positive commandments that are time-bound, that have a specific time component. So praying shacharis is time-bound, right? That has a specific time frame. But so that women are technically exempt from, but the obligation to pray, they're not exempt from according to this.
What
He
about
said,
Obligated to pray twice a day.
say again?
I thought we're obligated to pray twice a day, women.
yes,
Okay, where do you get that from?
the Mishnah Berurah?
My women's sitter.
Okay. Okay, so keep that in mind. We'll by the end of this year, maybe we'll be able to come back to that question. Okay, but the Rambam seems to be pretty clear that the mitzvah is 1 time a day.
Really?
But isn't a woman only exempt from certain forms of prayer because she has to do some other positive mitzvah?
Yeah, she definitely has to do other mitzvot, but the mitzvah of prayer, he seems to be saying, is is incumbent upon women.
For sure, in general, but any particular time, like chakras at 9 o'clock, if the baby is crying and such and such, if she has to do something else for someone else that no one else can do,
Right.
then
So,
is that that idea.
so that's one explanation for why women are generally exempt from time-bound positive commandments, is that there is an assumption that women are primarily occupied with caring for the house and the family, and therefore shouldn't have any time impositions put on them. That's one explanation for that exemption. There are other explanations. For some people, these explanations are disturbing and sexist and sound apologetic, and for some, they're beautiful and give a lot of meaning. We're not going to get into that broader discussion right now, but that is one explanation, right? That they have to find some time in the day, but there's no specific time of when.
If
He
a
says,
man, if a man is the actual caregiver for
yeah,
an infant,
yeah,
and the infant needs to be cared for, if the man thought he was going to a minyan, then presumably he's exempted from going to the minyan because he has that immediate mitzvah of care for the
yeah. So
child.
so that's a really interesting sort of theoretical question. About what is the mechanism by which he could justify not going to minyan, right? And so that gets into lots of interesting halachic concepts, right? So there's one question, right? Let's say, God forbid, someone becomes sick on Shabbos, or someone gets injured on Shabbos. It seems that usually kids get hurt. It's on Shabbos. Um, so there's a question, are the rules of Shabbos still in effect when caring for someone who's sick or ill, such that if possible, one should mitigate the amount of malacha that is done? Or do we say that once someone is in a category that's defined as sick or injured, then the rules of Shabbos don't apply? Right? So that's one sort of conceptual way of looking at it. So would we say that this man who's a primary caregiver for a child, would we say that he is exempt totally from going to minyan and he shouldn't feel badly about it at all? Or do we say that that obligation is still there, but it's pushed aside for a different obligation that trumps it, that trumps it in the here and the now? So there's some interesting right, and that's also why these explanations for women's exemption don't really work, because halachically speaking, right, we would all say the man should care for his child. Don't get me wrong, but halachically speaking, no one would say that the man is totally exempt from the mitzvah of davening with a minyan and going to shul, and davening in the proper time. But life circumstances might make it that he can't do that obligation in the here and the now. If you stick to one explanation, the logic gets a little bit messy when you try to apply it across other situations. So anyway, so we have, right, so we have the position of the Rambam that women are absolutely obligated in the mitzvah of prayer. And he says it also in the Sefer HaMitzvot, the fifth positive commandment, Hu shetzivanu la'avdo, is that God commanded us to serve him. Uchvar nichpal ze hatzivui pamim ba'amira ba'amro va'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem v'amar ve'otot avodu. So there's many times when we're told to worship God. Af al pi shezeh hatzivui hu gam kein me hatzivuim hakololim kemo shebiarnu hine yesh bo yichud echad shehu tzivui litfilah. Even though there's some technical issues at play here, but there is a specific commandment here for prayer. Lashon sifrei ula avdo zot tefillah, right? He quotes the Sifrei that to worship God, avoda is tefillah. Amru gamkin la avdo zot Talmud v'mishnatenu sharabi. Okay, he quotes some of what we saw in the Sifrei, but bottom line is the Rambam maintains that there is a positive commandment from the Torah to pray every day. The Ramban, quite interestingly, disagrees with the Rambam in source number 7. So again, this isn't to say that the Ramban doesn't think praying is important. And this isn't to say that the Ramban didn't pray every day. 3 times a day. I'm fairly confident that he did. He was a doctor just like the Rambam, so unless he was in surgery, I'm fairly confident that the Ramban prayed, I'd even say with a minyan, 3 times a day, most days of his life. But he says that the nature of that requirement is not from the Torah. And he brings a lot of proofs. You can go through it, source number 7, if you want. But right, he says there's a lot of technical halachot that would indicate that. Right, like one example is we have a concept. Right, what happens if someone's not sure if they davened? Right, someone woke up very early, got normally when they wake up they go to shul and they daven, but they were so busy today they can't remember, did I daven or not? So that's called a suffix. That's a question, a doubt whether you did it. And normally we say suffix d'oraita l'chumra. If there's a doubt as to whether you did not perform a biblical commandment, then you have to be strict and do it again. But suffix d'rabanan l'kula. But if it's a rabbinic obligation that you're in doubt about, then we're lenient. And so the rule is if you're not sure if you daven, you don't have to daven again. So that would be a good proof that it's not d'oraita. Right, at least for the first time of the day. So he says there is one biblical commandment around prayer, and that's found all the way at the end of this lengthy section from the Ramban, and that is Devar acher, zo tefila asmachtahi. Right, so when the Mishnah and the Gemara says that avoda is tefillah, it's just an asmachta. It's just a cute allusion, but it's not a fundamental requirement. Olomar, or perhaps it's to teach us shemichlal avoda shenilmod torato v'shnitpalel alav be'et hatzarot. Or maybe that what it means to worship God, Judy, this is very much like you said. It's all of them. Is that we need to study God's Torah, and we need to pray to him in times of trouble. That our eyes and our hearts should be directed to God, just like servants' eyes are directed to their master. Right, there's a verse in Sefer Bamidbar. We actually read this as part of our davening on Yom HaAtzmaut. When you come to war in your land, and the enemy is oppressing you, and you will sound the trumpets and be remembered before God. Hi mitzvah al sarah shetavo al tzibor lizok lifanav. So the mitzvah is, if the community finds itself in trouble, they must scream out to God. B'tfilo v'trua, through prayer and through the sounding of the shofar. V'unyan should be air. Okay, so he says there is a mitzvah of prayer from the Torah if you find yourself in a situation of trouble, a situation of real distress. So then you have an obligation to pray to God. But on a normal Tuesday in August, when life is going as life normally goes, there's no such requirement. And that is the fundamental machlokas, the fundamental disagreement between the Rambam and the Ramban. We'll stick with the order. So there's a beautiful idea from Rabbi Soloveitchik. I've taught this idea before. This might be familiar to some of you. Rabbi Soloveitchik says that while technically the Rambam and the Ramban disagree, right? Let's be clear. There is a machlokas. Again, it's only a machlokas about the nature of the biblical requirement of prayer. But Rabbi Soloveitchik says, in practice, there's no such difference. He wants to suggest that really, Rambam and Ramban both feel that the requirement to pray from the Torah is when one is in a situation of trouble or distress. And he says that they disagree not about that requirement, but they disagree about the definition of what it means to be in trouble or distress. The Ramban, Nachmanides, says that there has to be a real threat in front of you, right? If you're in Israel, living near the Gaza border, the enemy's guns is literally in your face. So that's a tzara, that's a trouble and a distress, which the Ramban would say that would necessitate a biblical requirement to pray. If you, God forbid, find yourself sick in the hospital, find yourself out of work and you need parnasa, right? So those are situations where the Ramban would say there is a direct and identifiable threat or distress. That's when the mitzvah kicks in. According to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rambam, Maimonides, maintains that just living life in itself is a precarious situation. Even if there's not an enemy with their gun drawn directly at you, or you're not in the hospital, or you're not finding yourself in extreme financial distress, just the ins and outs of daily life are by definition sarah, are by definition moments of distress. And we know that life is very fragile and very precarious, and things can change in a second. And so we always find ourselves in moments of distress. And perhaps we need that reminder, right? We need the daily obligation to pray because it's so easy to get caught up in the rhythms of life and forget that it is not such a given, that nothing is a given, and that we can't take things for granted. And so that's what sources 8 and 9 are showing, are different summaries of this beautiful explanation of Rabbi Soloveitchik, who says that really there's not such a big difference between the Rambam and the Ramban. And it's a very beautiful, powerful thought. I'm going to pause. Are there any reactions to this?
So then what they're both saying is you're only really obligated to pray it when you need something.
Right. That's what there's, according to this, you're only really obligated to pray when you need something. But again, you really always need something. You might not be attuned to what you need, but you really always need it.
There's a couple thoughts that I have.
Yeah.
It's Ari. It's the source that you cited was that we should pray on a daily basis is you shall serve God your Lord, and that this was in Deuteronomy, and then serve with all your heart, etc. It's like I don't see how we make the leap from saying that you should now do it on a daily basis and then a few times a day, from you shall serve God your Lord. And so I understand when there's this discrepancy between them about do you do it when there's a time of need, because then it wouldn't necessarily be every day or 3 times a day, or a time of distress, or a time of like incredible thanks,
Right.
when you have incredible appreciation or recognition that something happened, because of God's hand in it, and I think the more that you have an appreciation for all the things in your daily life that comes from God, all the things, even though as mundane as things may seem and as routine as they may seem, like things functioning properly with your health, things functioning properly within your family, and things going the way that, one would expect from day to day. I think if we have a recognition and appreciation that these things are coming from God, and that, even when something's not broken or distressed or not, like this amazing event happening or something that you're appreciating, then that could warrant that you're doing it 3 times a day or more,
Right. Right. So that's an interesting question for the Ramban and the Rambam with Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding, right? If would there be each experience of this tzara would trigger a new obligation to pray, or would it be still once a day? That's an interesting question.
And the other thing that I thought of was that when they talked about like somebody forgetting whether or not they prayed, well,
Right.
I could tell you that when I pray, it takes me a minimum of 20 to 30 minutes, when I do it. And, whether I'm davening the Shemona Esrei or the Shema or putting on tefillin or whatever it is, like it's something that I don't forget no matter how exhausted I am or sick or
Yeah.
whatever. And so that makes me then think, well, how could one forget that they prayed unless the prayer is not necessarily something as long as the 20 or 30 minutes that we're doing now or more? You know,
Yeah.
maybe it was just
Although
stopping
Ari,
for
you'd be surprised. I mean, I know you're, not all of us. Some of us strive to be at the level of prayer that you're at, but
that's
I've
not what
had
I'm saying.
days where I'm no, but I mean, I've definitely had days where I'd have to give it some thought. That I normally go to the Mincha Minyan at 2 o'clock. Did I go today or didn't I go
Uh,
today? Like it happens. It
but it
happens
makes
to
me
all of
wonder,
us.
it makes me wonder whether or not prayer back, the idea of what prayer was back then was more of kind of like just stopping from your daily routine for even a moment or couple moments, and then just thinking and connecting and appreciating, and not necessarily going through all these different things that we've accumulated over the centuries and whatever. And that would make it more likely that you would forget that you did that. You took a
Right.
moment to show appreciation. But the other question I had was, we talked about B'chal Levavcha, which was
Mm-hmm.
with service with all your heart, and then they were
Right.
referring to that as prayer.
Right.
So, but they didn't continue that thought about, well, what is B'chal Nafshecha? What is Nafshecha relating to? And then B'chal Meldecha, what is that then relating to?
Right.
I didn't see the thought continue with that. It kind of jumped to a different thing unless I missed it.
No, it didn't discuss that here.
So I
That's
feel like
something
that would
else.
be very interesting to kind of break that down and think about, well, what are those connecting to and all that. That's the last thing I wanted to say about that.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
So
That
so
different levels of the soul, for one thing.
it could be that, the elsewhere it talks about Meodecha might be with your money, Nafshecha, right? So that's the famous source. For those who are at Danny Epstein's talk over Shabbos, Afilu hu notel et nafshecha, even if God is taking away your soul, right? So that might be a source for martyrdom. But back to Ari's really important question. Part of it might be, and we're not going to have time to get into all of this right now, but you have in source number 13 from the Guide for the Perplexed, one of the places where Maimonides writes about his understanding of sacrifices. And so again, I think many of us are familiar with the fact that Maimonides says sacrifices are not necessarily the ideal way of form of worship, that he is of the opinion that this was kind of the religious discourse, the religious vocabulary, as it were, of the day, and for God to introduce a form of religious practice that was so disconnected from what everyone was used to would have been too far of a jump. So God sort of gave in to human nature and human culture of the time to allow for sacrifices, although really the ideal is to get to a place of prayer, of verbal prayer, without the sacrifices. That's one theory of the Rambam, and then there's all sorts of discussion. Is that really what he holds? Is that not what he holds? But so that might be a way of sort of conceptualizing this, sort of development of prayer as we know it, because we know there's a debate is where do the obligation to pray 3 times a day come from? We know it comes from the rabbis, but where did the rabbis get the idea? Do they get it from the Avos, from Avam, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Do they get it from the Korbanos? Do they get it from the sacrifices? There's a third opinion in the Yerushalmi that says it's because of based on the different positions of the sun throughout the day, which might really lend itself to what we've been saying, that really um, prayer is meant to sensitize us to all the changes and all the things going around in our life that require prayer, even if we don't necessarily feel that internal impulse on our own. So there's definitely a lot to say about this. In the short time we have left, I wanted to show 2 different things. The first is a really interesting tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein based on this, and we'll just look at the English. I was able to cut and paste the Hebrew text, but we'll just look at the English translation. Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked if there's a mitzvah for non-Jews to pray. Do non-Jews have an obligation to pray? We're on the second to last page. Actually, the third to last page for the English. Concerning a non-Jew, if they are, and this is a summary, this isn't the full thing. If they are obligated to pray, it is obvious they are not obligated, for it's not counted in their mitzvot. There are 7 mitzvot that B'nai Noach, that Noachites have. Prayer isn't one of them. But whether there is, it's not an obligation on them. It might, right? It's a tough distinction to make because he uses the same word. It says there's not an obligation, but there's a mitzvah, meaning they get credit if they pray, but it's not something they must do. We call that a mitzvah kiyumit. It's a mitzvah if you do it. You fulfill the mitzvah, but you're not obligated to do it. You're obligated to take lulav and etrog on the first day of Sukkot. If you take lulav and etrog on the second and the third and the fourth day of Sukkot, there's no obligation on you, but you've done a mitzvah. If you right, so it's an interesting distinction. Whether there's a mitzvah when they pray to God, it seems that there is. So they get mitzvah points, as it were, as it says in Isaiah, "Ki beiti beit tefillah yikarei lechol amim." My house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations. Even though they are exempt from the requirement to pray, nonetheless, if they do pray, they fulfill a commandment.
Would that hold for somebody in the process of conversion?
Oh, so that's a really interesting question also. Yeah, meaning if someone's in the process of conversion, they have an obligation to learn how to act properly as a full Jew. But whether they get mitzvah credit for those acts that they do before conversion, it would be at whatever level a non-Jew gets. So yes, someone in process of conversion has to go to shul and has to learn how to read from the siddur and have to say the prayers, but they wouldn't, whatever level of requirement there is on a Jew wouldn't be bound upon them until they complete the conversion process, if that makes sense. It would seem that they are the level of one who is not obligated in acts. But it appears to me that this is only in regard to establishing a requirement to prayer when they have no particular need to request something. But if they pray when they have a need, such as a sick person or a need for a job, it is an obligation. It is not a contradiction that it is not counted among their mitzvot, because it is essentially showing faith in God that only God can heal or provide sustenance. If one doesn't pray to God and trust in God, it's as if he is a non-believer. So the Rav Moshe here, at least for non-Jews, is paskening like the Ramban, that the requirement to pray is when there is a direct and identifiable need in front of you. And then it would become obligatory. He says for a non-Jew, it's obligatory not because we're adding an 8th mitzvah to them, but it's under the broader umbrella of believing in God, recognizing God's existence. So one more final issue is if we go back to number 14, and we're going to go through this a little bit quicker than we should be, but we're coming to the end of our time. So the Mishnah in Brachot tells us, Nashim v'avadim uktanim p'turin mikriyat shema minat tefillin v'chayavin b'tefillah v'mezuzah v'birkat hamazon. Women, servants, and minors are exempt from saying the Shema and from wearing tefillin, but they're obligated in prayer and mezuzah and birkat hamazon. So the Gemara wants to know, and the question sort of inferred, how could they be obligated in tefillah? How could they be obligated in prayer when prayer is presumably a time-bound mitzvah? Right? This is, I don't want to say before the Rambam, because obviously the Gemaras were in many centuries before the Rambam lived, but before the Chiddush that we saw the Rambam articulate. So the Gemara answers, Chayavin b'tefillah dirachamei ninhu. Because prayer is essentially asking for mercy. Mahu detema hoil uchtiv ba erev avoker v'tzaharayim mitzvat aseh zman gramadame. You might have thought that since there's a verse in Psalms that says we pray to God evening and morning and afternoon, that it's a positive time-bound commandment. Kamash malan, no. So this teaches us that really the essence of prayer is asking God for mercy. And as Rashi says, V'chayavin b'tfilah, they're obligated in prayer. The tfilah rachamehi u'midrabanan hi u'tiknua af l'nashim u'lechinuch ktanim. Because prayer is asking for God's mercy, and because prayer is dirabanan, is rabbinic in nature, at least praying 3 times a day, Rashi says that the rabbis instituted it for women and for educating children as well. Cheryl, where your sitter and is coming from with saying that women might be obligated twice a day is because there's a separate discussion about the nature of Mariv. Mariv is called Rishut. It's called a discretionary prayer. Everyone recognizes that Mariv is not at the same level of requirements as Shacharis and Mincha. So that could be because Mariv is, if we follow the model of Korbanot, there was no Korban offered at nighttime. It was just a time when they would continue to burn anything that wasn't consumed during the day. But so that might be where it comes from, is that because Shacharis and Mincha are full level obligations on a rabbinic level, that might be right. So if you maintain that women are obligated, that might be where it's coming from. So the Mishnah Berurah basically spells this out. And again, we'll just look at the English summary here. It is not a non-time-bound positive commandment. All this is in accordance with the Rambam, that only the times of prayer are rabbinic, but the essential requirements of prayer is from the Torah. Magen Avraham writes that based on this logic, most women do not regularly daven Shacharis or Mariv, but as soon as they awake in the morning, they say some prayer or request, and thereby fulfill their biblical obligation. But according to Ramban, that the essential commandment is rabbinic, i.e. the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, instituted the requirement to say the Amidah in the morning and the afternoon, and as a discretionary prayer at night, even though it's a positive commandment from the rabbis, which is time-bound, and normally women are exempt, nonetheless, they are obligated in Shacharis and Mincha like men, since they are petitions for mercy. This is correct and is the position of the majority of decisors. So that's where the notion of praying twice a day comes from for women. I heard an interesting discussion about this question is, so if women are davening, do they have to daven in the proper times? So it would seem that maybe yes, although the very widespread practice that I'm familiar with is women aren't so sensitive to praying at a specific time. But if we're saying that it was at least Shacharis and Mincha, which were instituted by the rabbis, and the rabbis included women in their takana, in their enactment of the requirement to say these prayers, so it would seem that maybe there is serious reason to think that women should stick to those times. And if they missed, davening Shacharis in its proper time, so then they would have to follow the rules of how to make up a prayer that was missed. So some really interesting stuff. Again, I think that what we did tonight, maybe for some of it was new and something you hadn't seen before. But I think in broad strokes, these are topics we've all thought about, we've all heard talks about, and I think it's again, don't take for granted that everyone has seen it, and even if you've heard discussions, you might not have seen some of the sources on which they're based. But also, I think that something as fundamental for a shul community as prayer, it's worthwhile revisiting some of these core concepts and these core sources every once in a while. So that was tonight's share. Are there any final questions or thoughts on anything that we saw?
I noticed in the data this afternoon, after having reviewed this earlier in the day, that there is, one of the prayers in the Amida mentions Rachamim. It mentions asking, specifically for mercy, and mercy for the whole of Kalal Yisrael too, So it's right there. It's right there in the Amida. So I just wanted to mention that.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I find it's interesting still how they equate b'chol levavcha with prayer
Yeah.
and not b'chol nafshecha, because you would think like your soul would be the one that would be connected with prayer, let's say. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And the other thing that we touched on a little bit was the power of communal prayer versus individual prayer.
Right.
And to me, the ultimate example that I think of with the power of communal prayer is before the Beit HaMikdash, when we were in Egypt and we were all praying to God that God should save us. And it talks about in the Torah that God heard our prayer, that God heard our communal prayer, basically.
Right.
And it took that many voices and that much effort and time of those voices coming together for God to then kind of decide that it's time to make that move. And so to me, that is like, the penultimate example in what I know, about like the power of communal prayer versus individual prayer also, and then why communal prayer could be helpful for us too as a community.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Beautiful.
Refuah Shlema, Avi.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
The whole trajectory of Hasidus is based in Lubavitch upon the Alter Rebbe's decision to not continue further study in Talmud, but to go and to learn how to pray. And it's not true that the nefesh doesn't need to be involved with prayer, because they understand it to mean the animal soul, the lowest level, which has to be convinced to put its own concern for survival and its own inherent selfishness aside and come along and bring the passion and the energy into the prayer that is needed to really ask for mercy.
That's beautiful.
So there's a whole lot in Hasidus about it.
Yeah. I'll take the anti-Hasidic view for now and just say that there's I think in the way that we refer to nefesh might not be the same understanding in the in the world of the Bible of what nefesh means.
Is both sides of the heart.
Right.
And that means both. That's another reference to the same concept.
Yeah.
So it's in Lavcha anyway.
Okay. Anyway, really great conversation.
I think of nefesh as like God put into us, right?
Yeah.
I don't think of nefesh as an animal, as much as like our soul, our life-giving force. I feel like that God is a part of God, that God's sharing with us while we're here,
Yeah. Does mean that, sure.
Yeah. All right, great talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. It's great to see everyone. Next week I am on vacation, so there's not going to be a share next week. But we will resume in 2 weeks, please God. And I won't be in shul either, so hope you have a great rest of the week, and look forward to reconnecting after the beach.
Thank you. Enjoy your vacation.
Okay, thanks.
Good
Thank
vacation.
you.
Okay.